Okay, thanks. We're back for part two of discussion with Herb Simmens, climate activist, author of a Climate Vocabulary of the Future. In the last discussion, we talked about how we need to take a rational approach to solving the climate crisis, which threatens life a lot more short term than we think. And today we are going to talk about a key thing to get done is to restore a safe temperature on planet Earth as soon as possible using direct climate cooling and perhaps other things. Herb, take it away.
Okay, what I'd like to do is go through briefly some of the approaches to cooling, because it's easy to say, well, we need cooling and that will help to protect the climate, but what does that mean and can we do it? So we're not, and I'm not here to say this one technique is the panacea or the only way to do it or is guaranteed to work, but we have a portfolio of ideas, and no doubt if and when the world community ever says we want to do cooling, I'm sure we'll get lots more ideas come from the ingenuity of the 7 billion of us. But so I just want to briefly point out the variety of things. You see on the slides there, hollow glass microspheres being proposed by a group called the Arctic Ice Project, run by a colleague of mine, Leslie Field. Basically, they have discovered and perfected, you see the three sort of mounds there in the slide, these tiny little microspheres, almost like, little balls of a, 16th of an inch or whatever, made out of a substance that's non-toxic and that could be put around ice right now in the Arctic at the edge of ice and replace the warm and a dark sea with the cooler, lighter spheres. And they're doing research now to make sure that it is safe and effective, and they may be able to start putting these in the seas subject to government approval within a couple of years or so. So that's one approach. And again, the idea there is that by replacing the dark sea with these light white spheres, you're basically reflecting more of the heat away from the Arctic and cooling it, preventing the ice from melting, keeping it stable, and thus reducing the risk of extreme weather. Okay, moving on, let's see what's next. Here's another approach on the left, where you basically, it's a simple idea. You take, there's cold water in the Arctic, obviously the actual water itself is cold. You get a pump, like you see on the left, to basically pump up the water, and you could use little windmills. It's not shown in this slide, but the top of this would be like a little windmill to have the pump. And then you would basically take the seawater that you're pumping from the ocean, and you would have the cold, ice cold water you would put out over the ice. And so you basically, you'd be able then to extend the ice. That's a second approach. Let's continue on. All right, there was a third one I didn't have a photo of, but it involved, and it's another colleague of ours from Harvard who is proposing putting literally millions of specially constructed mirrors all over the land throughout the world that could cool the planet. This fourth one is called marine cloud brightening, marine being ocean, brightening the clouds. And what that vehicle is actually kind of like a hydrofoil that skims the surface, and it has those three towers. This is not actually existing anywhere, but it's a artist's rendition. And basically what would happen is that the seawater with a particular type of ice, of salt rather, of an exact size based upon scientific analysis, would basically be blown up to the clouds, would be shot up to the clouds, just salt and water, no harsh chemicals, nothing weird, nothing dangerous. And a lot of research is showing that would basically change the reflectivity of the clouds and thus help cool the planet. And at least one study
So it would reflect more light back up.
Right, back away from the Earth
Yeah.
by changing the reflectivity of the clouds temporarily, of course. So you could stop it at any time, and you could move these ships. In fact, there's a proposal to move a fleet of these ships, for example, to the Gulf of Mexico during hurricane season. And by increasing the reflectivity of the clouds and cooling the climate, you could possibly significantly reduce the intensity of hurricanes. Relatively safe, relatively inexpensive compared to the cost of climate change. And at least one study showed that 700 of these ships in the right places on the planet could conceivably reduce temperatures by 1 degree, and thus basically negate most of the climate change we've already had, simply by putting salt into the atmosphere. Now, again, more research is needed, and may turn out that they're intractable problems, but it also may turn out that for essentially almost no negligible cost compared to, the cost of, one battleship or one, aircraft carrier, you could essentially significantly cool the planet, save millions of lives, reduce harm, and buy us time. So moving on from that one.
As an aside, that makes me want to ask about something I've been thinking about lately. So the current budget proposed by President Biden for the military is above $800 billion, which is yet another increase. We keep increasing the military budget year after year after year. Maybe should we be converting? I mean, if the military is there to protect national security, the biggest threat to life is the climate crisis. Should not the military be involved in this, or at least if we're not redirecting dollars, we get the military involved by converting aircraft carriers to do something like this?
I think that's an excellent idea. It's one I've been promoting, and you may then get bipartisan support if you're increasing the military budget, but a good chunk of it is going for national security to support projects like this. Absolutely.
Okay, let's get to the next slide.
So this is the most controversial one. It's called stratospheric aerosol injection, where you're literally injecting into the sky particles of sulfur or other materials that reflect light. You could do it from the surface, or you could have what, like this shows, a high altitude blimp or a special aircraft. And it basically would cool the planet by putting a series of trillions of particles. It's very controversial because it's seen as, it's what's sort of the classic geoengineering technique that's seen as, darkening the skies and playing God and all the rest of this. But, I would remind people before you give up on it, or don't even, sort of open your eyes to the possibility that what this is doing is essentially exactly or almost exactly equivalent to what volcanoes do when they naturally emit enormous quantities of sulfur and other particles into the sky. And when Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines, or Indonesia, I'm sorry, I forgot which one, erupted earlier in the 20th century, it actually led to the planet's atmosphere being cooled by about 1 degree for a whole year, the whole planet. And, now obviously there were differential effects in different locations. So one of my colleagues in our group has written a scientific paper calling for what he calls a 2 Pinatubo strategy, essentially putting enough particles that would be equal to 2 Pinatubo eruptions. So that's the classic technique. And essentially what we're saying is, like, let's do artificial controlled volcanoes. So let's move on to the next one just because of time here. Iron salt aerosols are actually very similar to the one showing the ship going up. They can be done from land as well. They don't, they have multiple benefits. I won't go into them right now, but it's a similar technique to marine cloud brightening using salt again, iron salt. and iron particles into the sky. And again, all of these would require more research, more careful field testing before they can or should be deployed.
So wait, did these both reflect light and also actually remove CO2 and methane? Oh, wait.
Well, iron salt aerosols may be able to when they're in the ocean, be able to do that as well. It's very early on in the research for that, but it's very promising. It's a very promising approach that, as you point out and this slide points out, has many potential benefits. And again, our group is not saying let's do it. Our group is saying let's put the world community behind accelerated research to find out just what those benefits are and what the problems are, if any, associated with it.
It sounds like the key, based on our previous discussion and looking at these things, and it's good to have an open mind when considering these things, considering that the severity of the crisis, we really need to find solutions. But it sounds like the main thing you're advocating for is intense, fast research to find out, can this stuff work? Can it be done safely? And, how effective is it? And, through things like the National Science Foundation or the DARPA.
Exactly. In fact, the National Science Foundation came out with a report last year advocating research on this. They want the U.S. to spend a couple $100 million a year on this. We didn't think it was enough money or as quickly, but it's certainly moving us in the right direction. And I should say most of the scientists, and I rely on the scientists in our group and others who've looked at this, are pretty confident that some combination of these techniques will likely be able to significantly cool the planet without a whole lot of risk. But we're not prepared, at least officially, to say for sure. And even if we did, nobody should take our word for it. There should be publicly commissioned research. Again, the key is urgency, public oversight of the research, objectivity, and that's what's been missing in a lot of this. It's uncoordinated. One university does one experiment one year, another experiment, and that's no way to do it when you're trying to save the planet.
Should I go to the next slide?
Yeah. Okay. This is more about iron salt aerosols, and may also be able to remove methane from the atmosphere through what's called methane oxidation. It's another thing that remains to be 100% proven, but looks promising. So we can go on to the next. Okay, basically those were some of the techniques. Why don't we take the slides down? And in the last couple of minutes for now, we can, let me just say that there are other more modest techniques that can cool, particularly locally, ranging from literally painting every dark roof white in hot climates to having green roofs, like the building I live in Silver Spring, that has plants and foliage rather than a black tarred asphalt roof, which is the absolute worst thing you could do for the climate. And it creates something called the urban heat island effect. You could also literally paint asphalt streets white. Los Angeles has started an experiment with that a couple of years ago. And they're seeing if they could find the right kind of paint that's durable and will do that. So not everything involves 700 ships, blasting trillions of particles of salt into the atmosphere. But it may be a combination of some ships and some Mount Pinatubo type sulfur particles and a worldwide campaign to paint roofs white, and so forth like that, and paint streets white, putting them together in a plan. And that's what we're calling for, that is not directly connected to reducing emissions. It's directly connected to cooling us, which is the goal of reducing emissions, but doing it directly. So that's really what we're proposing, and what I hope and encourage the viewers of this presentation and discussion to look at more. And I guess further in our next segment, we can discuss more what kind of policies government should do. And let's wrap this up for now.
All right, Herb, thanks so much. We'll hopefully talk more later about how we can take steps especially at the local level, since we're both here in Montgomery County. All right, thanks very much. And I'm going to stop the recording as soon as I can find the stop recording button. Thanks, everybody.